Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In the heart of downtown Grand Junction, Colorado, a city nestled in the western part of the state where the Colorado River carves through red rock landscapes, there was a man who had become part of the fabric of the community. Warren Bruce Barnes, 69 years old, lived a life that many would consider unconventional. He was homeless, without a permanent address or a roof to call his own, but to describe him simply as homeless would miss the essence of who he truly was. Warren had found his own version of home in a breezeway between Monique's bridal shop and Out West Books, where he spent his days absorbed in paperback novels, usually westerns, the pages transporting him to frontier landscapes and tales of adventure. The local shop owners and merchants had given him a nickname that captured his daily routine and his gentle presence: the Reading Man. Warren was not invisible or forgotten. He was valued, loved, and woven into the daily life of downtown Grand Junction. Business owners looked forward to seeing him in his usual spot. Passers-by recognized him as a fixture of the community. He was somebody, not nobody. He mattered to the people who knew him, and his presence added something meaningful to the neighborhood he inhabited. This fact would become heartbreakingly important in the days following his disappearance. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, another life was unfolding along a very different trajectory. Brian Cohy Jr. was 19 years old in early 2021, living with his parents in Grand Junction. From the outside, he appeared to be a young man navigating the challenges of late adolescence, but beneath the surface, darkness was brewing. Brian had been diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions, including major depressive disorder, autism, anxiety, and what some described as a schizophrenic disorder. He struggled to connect with others, to process emotions in conventional ways, and to find his place in the world. But more troubling than his diagnoses was what occupied his thoughts. Brian had developed what described as a fascination with the morbid. He was interested in death, in mortality, in the mechanics of killing. Brian compared himself to notorious serial killer Edmund Kemper, who had murdered his grandparents, 6 young women, and his own mother. He consumed content about serial killers, studied their methods, and wondered what it would feel like to take a human life. This wondering evolved from passive curiosity into active planning. For approximately 6 months leading up to February 2021, Brian had been contemplating murder. It wasn't a sudden impulse or a momentary fantasy. It was a sustained interest that grew stronger over time. He had decided that when he finally acted on this curiosity, he would target someone whose absence might not be immediately noticed, someone society often overlooked. He planned to kill either a homeless person or a prostitute, calculating that these vulnerable individuals would be easier victims whose disappearance would create minimal attention. It was a cold, predatory assessment that revealed both his intent and his complete lack of empathy for his potential victims. On the night of February 27, 2021, Brian got into his 2007 Ford 500 and began driving through the neighborhoods of Grand Junction. He was hunting, searching for someone to kill. The temperature had dropped as evening turned to night, the cold settling over the city. Brian drove past houses where families were settling in for the evening, past businesses closing for the night, looking for the right victim, the right opportunity. Eventually, he made his way to an area near Crosby Avenue, where Highway 340 passes over local roads on an overpass. This area, with its shadows and relative isolation, was a place where some of Grand Junction's homeless population found shelter. Beside the railway tracks that ran between the roads under the overpass, Warren Barnes had laid down for the night. At 69 years old, Sleeping rough in February's cold was a necessity he had grown accustomed to. Perhaps he was already dreaming, his mind drifting through the pages of the Western novel he had been reading earlier that day. He had no way of knowing that someone was approaching, no reason to suspect that his ordinary routine of finding shelter for the night would lead to anything other than another morning when he would return to his spot in the breezeway to continue his book. Brian spotted Warren sleeping beside the tracks. This was what he had been searching for, a homeless person, alone, vulnerable, exactly the type of victim he had decided upon months earlier. Brian parked his car and prepared himself with chilling deliberateness. He put on 3 layers of gloves, ensuring he wouldn't leave fingerprints or DNA evidence on his victim. He picked up a knife, a kitchen knife that would serve as his murder weapon. Then he approached the sleeping man with predatory intent. Warren awoke to a nightmare he couldn't have imagined. A stranger was attacking him with a knife, stabbing him repeatedly. In his panic and confusion, Warren cried out words that would later haunt everyone who heard them repeated. "What are you doing? Why?" It was the desperate plea of someone who couldn't comprehend what was happening, who sought some explanation for the violence being inflicted upon him. Why would anyone want to hurt him? What had he done to deserve this? But there was no rational answer to his questions, because the attack had nothing to do with anything Warren had done. Brian Cozy was killing him simply to experience what murder felt like. Warren's pleas, those desperate questions about why this was happening, went unanswered as the attack continued. Eventually, Warren Barnes succumbed to his injuries, dying in the cold darkness under the overpass, killed by a stranger for no reason other than that stranger's curiosity about what killing would feel like. But Brian wasn't finished. What he did next revealed a level of depravity that would shock. Using his knife, Brian decapitated Warren's body of a man who just hours earlier had been feeding birds and reading books into plastic bags. Brian carried these bags to his car and placed them inside. Then he returned to the crime scene and collected the remaining body parts, loading Warren's body parts into his plastic bags. He drove to the Blue Heron boat ramp on the Colorado River and attempted to dispose of the majority of Warren's remains by dumping them into the water. But something went wrong. Brian drove too close to the water's edge, and his Ford 500 became stuck in the river, the vehicle flooding as water poured inside. Brian called for help, and a tow truck arrived to extract his car from the river. Police officers responded to the scene as well, but they had no reason to suspect that the young man whose car had gotten stuck at the boat ramp was anything other than someone who had made a driving error. They allowed Brian to leave without further investigation. He drove home with Warren's head and hands still hidden in plastic bags in his vehicle. Once home, Brian cleaned the blood from his knife and car, took pictures of Warren's severed head with his phone, and then went to sleep. The next day, he deleted the photos because they were evidence, demonstrating an awareness that what he had done was criminal and that he needed to conceal proof of his actions. Brian placed the plastic bags containing Warren's body parts in his bedroom closet, hiding them among his belongings. For days they remained there, decomposing in the darkness while life in the Cozy household continued its ordinary rhythms. Brian's parents had no idea what their son had done, no suspicion that human remains were hidden just feet away from where they slept and ate and went about their daily lives. Meanwhile, in downtown Grand Junction, Warren's absence was noticed immediately. When he didn't appear in his usual spot in the breezeway, the people who knew him became concerned. Warren was consistent in his routines, reliable in his presence. For him to simply not show up was completely out of character. Business owners who looked for him each day began to worry. Had something happened to him? Was he sick or injured? Their concern grew as one day without Warren turned into 2, then 3. The reading man had vanished without a trace. On March 1st, 2021, 2 days after Warren's murder, Terry Cozy was cleaning her son's bedroom. It was an ordinary task, the kind of housekeeping that parents do, putting away clothes, organizing belongings, tidying up the space. As she worked, she noticed an unpleasant smell coming from Brian's closet. Following the odor to its source, Terry began investigating. She found a plastic container and started looking through it. What she discovered would shatter her world and her understanding of her own son. Inside plastic bags in that container were human remains, decomposing and unmistakable. The horror of that moment is difficult to comprehend. A mother, performing a routine household chore, suddenly confronted with evidence of brutal murder in her son's bedroom. Terry immediately called 911, reporting the gruesome discovery to authorities. During that call, she acknowledged that Brian had displayed a disturbing fascination with death and morbidity, connecting his interests to the terrible things now found in his closet. Police were dispatched to the Cozy residence at approximately 1:48 p.m. When officers arrived, they found Terry Cozy devastated by what she had discovered. They needed to speak with Brian, who was not home when his mother made the discovery. As police were processing the scene and trying to understand what they were dealing with, Brian returned home. Body camera footage captured what happened next, a moment so chilling that it became central evidence in the case that would follow. As officers approached Brian in front of his family's home, they asked him a simple question. "Your parents have concerns of some stuff they may have found in your room. What would it be?" Brian's response was delivered with an eerie calmness that suggested either complete emotional detachment or a total lack of understanding about the gravity of the situation. "Yes, I believe so," he said. "A human head and hands, from that man who went missing. I killed him with a knife." The casual nature of his confession was deeply disturbing. This was not someone racked with guilt or terror about being caught. This was someone matter-of-factly acknowledging murder and dismemberment as though discussing the weather. Officers immediately detained Brian and transported him to the police station for formal interrogation. What they would learn during that interview painted a picture of a calculated, deliberate killing. During interrogation, Brian provided investigators with a detailed account of how he had murdered Warren Barnes. He told them he had been driving on the roads under the overpass when he spotted Warren sleeping beside the railway tracks. He explained how he had prepared himself with 3 layers of gloves and approached with a knife. He recounted Warren's desperate questions, "What are you doing? Why?" and described his own animalistic behavior during the attack. He admitted to decapitating the body and removing the hands, to attempting to dispose of the remains in the Colorado River, and to taking photographs of the severed head before deleting them. He even told investigators the victim's name, demonstrating that he had somehow learned Warren's identity, though whether this occurred before or after the murder remained unclear. Perhaps most chillingly, Brian told investigators exactly why he had killed Warren Barnes. "I've always wondered what murder felt like," he said. He explained that he had been planning to kill someone for approximately 6 months. He revealed his targeting criteria: homeless people or prostitutes, individuals he believed no one would miss or whose disappearance would go unnoticed. He compared himself to Edmund Kemper, making explicit the connection between his crime and the serial killers he admired. Based on his confession, Brian Cozy Jr. was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. He was taken to the Mesa County Detention Facility to await trial. The recovered photographs from his phone, the physical evidence from the crime scene in his home, his own detailed confession, all of it pointed to guilt that seemed impossible to dispute. As news of Warren Barnes's murder spread through Grand Junction, the community reacted with shock and grief. The gentle man who had sat reading books in the breezeway was gone, killed in a senseless act of violence by someone who saw him as disposable. But the community pushed back against that characterization. Warren was not disposable. Warren was not someone whose absence went unnoticed. The outpouring of remembrance and love proved exactly how wrong Brian Cozy's assumptions had been. Monique Lanati, who owned the bridal shop where Warren had spent so many of his days, spoke movingly about the man they had lost. He was valued. He was loved. "He is missed every single day," she said. Other business owners shared similar sentiments, describing Warren's kindness, his love of reading, his generosity with the birds, his willingness to help anyone who needed anything. Warren's cousin, Joan Barnes Graham, addressed the court during later proceedings with a statement that captured what so many felt. He would help anyone who needed anything, including the defendant. He was not a throwaway person. Brian Cozy's trial began on January 17, 2023, nearly 2 years after the murder. The delay had occurred due to various setbacks, including the need for extensive mental health evaluations. Brian pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, with his defense attorneys arguing that his diagnosed mental health conditions, major depressive disorder, autism, and what they characterized as psychotic episodes, had rendered him legally insane at the time of the murder. According to the defense, Brian had experienced a psychotic break when he saw Warren's makeshift shelter, and this mental state had driven him to commit murder without understanding right from wrong. The prosecution presented a very different argument. They pointed to Brian's own admissions that he had been planning to kill someone for 6 months. They highlighted his deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims, his preparation with multiple layers of gloves to avoid leaving evidence, his attempts to dispose of the body, and his deletion of incriminating photographs. All of these actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated that Brian understood the consequences of his actions, understood that murder was wrong, and took steps to avoid being caught. This awareness meant he did not meet Colorado's legal standard for insanity, which requires that a person be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong at the time a crime is committed due to a mental disease or defect. Multiple expert witnesses testified during the trial. 2 psychologists with the state of Colorado who had examined Brian for his insanity plea both concluded that he was not legally insane at the time of the murder. They acknowledged his mental health diagnoses, but maintained that having mental disorders does not automatically equal legal insanity. A person can be mentally ill and still understand that killing is wrong. Another psychologist, hired by the defense, offered a contrary opinion, testifying that Brian had experienced a psychotic episode triggered by seeing Warren that rendered him temporarily insane. The jury heard testimony from Brian's therapist, family doctor, and multiple psychologists. They watched the body camera footage of Brian's calm confession. They saw the photographs Brian had taken of Warren's severed head. They heard recordings of Brian's police interviews where he expressed excitement as he recounted the details of the murder. They learned about his 6 months of planning, his deliberate victim selection, and his efforts to conceal evidence. After approximately 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. On February 3, 2023, in a courtroom packed with more than 30 friends and relatives of Warren Barnes, the verdict was read. Brian Cozy Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was also found guilty of tampering with a deceased human body and tampering with physical evidence. Brian displayed no visible reaction upon hearing the verdict, maintaining the same emotional flatness that had characterized his confession nearly 2 years earlier. For the people who had loved Warren, the verdict brought some measure of justice, an acknowledgement that what had been done to him was murder and that his killer would be held accountable. Sentencing was scheduled for February 6, 2023. The courtroom again filled with Warren's friends, family, and community members who wanted to witness this final chapter. During the hearing, multiple people spoke about the impact of Warren's loss. They described not only who Warren had been, but also the hole his absence had created in their lives and in the downtown Grand Junction community. They challenged the assumption that had led Brian Cozy to target Warren in the first place. The idea that a homeless person's life doesn't matter or wouldn't be missed. They proved, through their testimony and their presence, that Warren Barnes had mattered immensely. Brian's mother Terry also spoke, asking that her son's sentence include mental health treatment. She described Brian as someone who had struggled for his entire life with emotions, and stated that he does not think and feel like the rest of us. It was a mother's plea for her child, even as she grappled with the reality of what he had done. Brian himself chose not to speak during his sentencing. The judge pronounced sentence. Brian Cozy Jr. was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 13.5 years for the evidence tampering charges. The consecutive nature of the life sentence meant that Brian, who was 21 years old at sentencing, would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. He would never be released, never have the opportunity to harm another person, never experience freedom again. The case raised difficult questions that resist easy answers. How much responsibility does someone with diagnosed mental health conditions bear for their actions? Where is the line between mental illness and evil? Can someone be both mentally unwell and fully culpable for murder? The jury concluded that Brian Cohy understood what he was doing when he killed Warren Barnes, that he knew it was wrong, and that his mental health diagnoses did not absolve him of responsibility. Whether one agrees with this conclusion likely depends on broader beliefs about criminal justice, mental health, and accountability. What remains beyond debate is the loss of Warren Barnes. He was 69 years old, a man who had lived a life that didn't conform to conventional standards, but who had found his place and his community in downtown Grand Junction. He loved books and birds. He helped people who needed help. He never bothered anyone or demanded anything. He had a gentle spirit captured in 3 simple words. And you also. He deserved to live out his remaining years in peace, to continue reading his beloved Western novels, to feed the birds that gathered at his feet, to offer his quiet kindness to the people who passed through the breezeway. Instead, Warren's life ended in terror and pain under a cold overpass, at the hands of someone who saw him as nothing more than a test subject for curiosity about murder. Brian Cohy was wrong about Warren Barnes. Warren was not someone whose absence would go unnoticed. Warren was not disposable or forgettable. The tears shed at his sentencing hearing, the words spoken by those who knew him, all of it proves that Warren Barnes mattered, that his life had value, and that his death left a wound in his community that will never fully heal. Story 2. The January sun rose over Winter Park, Florida, on a Saturday morning that should have been filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the crack of baseball bats connecting with balls. In a comfortable home on Temple Drive, where a family of 4 had built their lives together, silence hung heavy in the air where there should have been the bustling energy of a weekend morning. 11-year-old Sawyer Redlick waited at the baseball field with his teammates, scanning the parking lot for the familiar figure of his father, his coach, the man who never missed a game. But Michael Redlick would not arrive that morning, nor any morning after. Inside the house he had worked so hard to make a stable home for his children, 65-year-old Michael lay dead on the floor, a victim of violence that would shock a community and reveal the dark complexity of family bonds twisted beyond recognition. Michael Redlick's life had been a testament to achievement and reinvention. For more than 2 decades, he had navigated the high-stakes world of professional sports as an executive, leaving his mark on iconic organizations including the Cleveland Cavaliers, Cleveland Browns, Memphis Grizzlies, San Francisco 49ers, and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He was a marketing genius, a man who generated revenue and built partnerships everywhere he worked. Colleagues knew him as Red, a nickname that matched his warm personality and brilliant smile. With a law degree and a master's in sports management from Ohio University, Michael had the credentials and the charisma to command respect in boardrooms and locker rooms alike. But in 2013, at an age when many executives are climbing toward the pinnacle of their careers, Michael made a choice that surprised many in the sports industry. He left the glamour and excitement of professional sports to accept a position at the University of Central Florida, taking a substantial pay cut to become the Director of External Affairs and Partnership Relations for the DeVos Sport Business Management Program. To those who knew him well, the decision made perfect sense. Michael had grown weary of constantly moving his family from city to city as opportunities arose. More importantly, he had 2 children, Jaden and Sawyer, whose stability and happiness mattered more to him than any professional accolade. At UCF, Michael found his true calling in mentoring the next generation. Students flocked to him, drawn by his industry knowledge, his straightforward advice, and his genuine investment in their success. He organized speaker series, led service trips to post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans to rebuild homes, and mentored students as they organized charity runs for the One Pulse Foundation following the tragic nightclub shooting. More than 200 students and alumni would later share stories of how Michael had encouraged them, challenged them to think bigger, and helped them chart their paths to careers in sports business. But what struck everyone most profoundly about Michael was his devotion to his children. Colleagues at UCF recalled how nearly every conversation with Michael eventually turned to Jaden and Sawyer. He would light up talking about Sawyer's batting average or on-base percentage, his pride as both father and coach evident in every word. He brought Jaden on service trips, working shoulder to shoulder with her to rebuild homes for families in need. When she stood up at a lecture featuring Sharon Robinson, daughter of baseball legend Jackie Robinson, to ask an insightful question about race and sports, Michael beamed with the pride of a father watching his child find her voice. The path that had brought Michael to this point in his life, living in Winter Park with Danielle and their 2 children, was unconventional and complicated. Michael's second wife had been Danielle's mother, a woman stricken with cancer who faced mounting medical bills and inadequate insurance coverage. Friends later told investigators that Michael had married her to help her access better health care, an act of compassion during an impossible time. When she succumbed to the disease, Michael and Danielle, grieving the same loss from different perspectives, found comfort in each other. Danielle was 20 years Michael's junior, his former stepdaughter now becoming his romantic partner. They married and built a family together, welcoming 2 children who became the center of Michael's world. From the outside, they appeared to be a typical suburban family, attending football games together, coaching youth baseball, navigating the ordinary rhythms of school and work. But behind closed doors, tension simmered beneath the surface of their relationship. Neighbors observed that Michael would sometimes move out of the family home temporarily, an attempt to shield Jaden and Sawyer from witnessing their parents' conflicts. Friends noticed troubling patterns and warned Michael that the situation was escalating. One family friend, Jerry Rubacki, later recalled telling Michael repeatedly, "The consequences are going to get worse here. They're going to get more dramatic." January 11th, 2019, began as an ordinary Friday for the Redlick family. Michael went to work at UCF, engaging with students and colleagues in the program he had helped build. Danielle went about her day, exchanging text messages with Michael at various points. That evening, the family attended Sawyer's football game together, appearing to be a united front. But after they returned home, after the children went to their rooms for the evening, the facade crumbled. According to what Danielle would later testify, Michael began drinking heavily, pouring himself strong drinks that loosened whatever restraint had held his emotions in check. Rage began to pour out of him, words escalating into confrontation. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny, competing narratives, and ultimately a jury's deliberation. The undisputed facts were these. At some point during the late evening or early morning hours, Michael Redlick sustained a fatal stab wound to his shoulder. The weapon was a large serrated kitchen knife from their own home. Blood spread across the foyer floor, soaking into towels and pooling in patterns that would later tell investigators a story about what happened after Michael fell. For approximately 11 hours, while Michael's body lay in their home, Danielle did not call for help. During those 11 hours, Danielle engaged in activities of systematic attempt to avoid responsibility. She cleaned blood from surfaces, creating circular patterns in the blood evidence that investigators immediately recognized. She filled a 5-gallon bucket with pinkish water, evidence of washing away blood. She soaked mops in blood and towels in cleaning solution. At approximately 9:30 on the morning of January 12th, Danielle finally called 911. The call that morning would become crucial evidence in understanding her state of mind and her initial attempts to control the narrative. She told the dispatcher that she thought her husband was deceased. She claimed he might have had a heart attack. In some accounts given to first responders, she suggested that Michael had stabbed himself. None of these explanations would withstand medical examination. When Winter Park police officers arrived at the Temple Drive residence, they encountered what one prosecutor would later describe as a horror scene. Michael's body lay just inside the front door, blood staining his jeans and the floor around him. The evidence of cleaning attempts was obvious and extensive. Officers took Danielle to the hospital, where they interviewed her about what had transpired. Her story began to shift and evolve. The medical examiner's findings contradicted Danielle's initial claims completely. Michael had not suffered a heart attack. There was no indication of cardiac distress or vomit in his system that would suggest such an event. The stab wound to his shoulder was definitively not self-inflicted based on the angle and depth of penetration. Additionally, Michael bore other injuries: a cut beneath his eye, bruising on the inside of his upper lip, and defensive wounds on his arm consistent with trying to protect himself during an attack. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. After a 3-week investigation, Winter Park police determined they had sufficient evidence to charge Danielle Redlick with second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. On February 6, 2019, officers arrested her, and she was booked into the Orange County Jail. She faced the possibility of life in prison if convicted. Bond was denied initially, and Danielle began what would become a 3-year wait for her day in court. During those years, details about the Redlick family and their relationship emerged that painted a more complex picture than a simple murder case. Jaden and Sawyer, now forced to live without their father and facing the possibility of their mother being convicted of killing him, spoke to investigators about the dynamics they had witnessed. Both children described tension between their parents, but significantly, they identified Danielle as usually being the aggressor during fights. They noted that the relationship had seemed to be improving in recent months leading up to January 2019, only deteriorating again in the final days before their father's death. The trial finally began in June 2022, more than 3 years after Michael's death. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Sean Wiggins, presented a methodical case arguing that Danielle had stabbed her husband during an argument and then engaged in an elaborate cover-up. Wiggins told jurors that the evidence would show Danielle did everything she could to avoid responsibility for her actions. He walked the jury through the timeline of those 11 hours, emphasizing her activities on the dating app, the deleted text messages, and the extensive cleaning of the crime scene. The prosecution portrayed a woman who had calculated her next moves, who had prioritized her own interests over getting help for her dying or already dead husband, who had lied repeatedly to first responders about how Michael died. The defense strategy centered on a claim that would become the crux of the case: self-defense. Danielle's attorneys argued that she had been trapped in a relationship marked by more than a decade of domestic abuse. They contended that on the night of January 11th, Michael had become violent in a way that made Danielle fear for her life. When Danielle took the witness stand in her own defense, she described being pinned against the kitchen island, unable to breathe, believing she was going to die. "I couldn't breathe," she testified, describing the moments before she reached for the knife. According to Danielle's testimony, she grabbed the kitchen knife and positioned it toward Michael. She described how he immediately lunged at her, and in that moment, the knife penetrated his shoulder. Afterward, she claimed she fled to the bathroom to get away from him, hiding there for approximately 15 minutes while she heard him yelling and then falling silent. She said Michael had taken her phone earlier, preventing her from calling for help immediately. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, she found Michael unresponsive. She attempted to call 911, but the call didn't go through. She tried to resuscitate him, panicked, and then began cleaning. The defense emphasized that Danielle recognized the danger she faced that night was different from previous incidents of abuse. They argued that her perception of imminent deadly force justified her use of deadly force in response. The fact that she had previously filed a domestic violence complaint against Michael supported their narrative of an abusive relationship. But the prosecution pushed back hard against this characterization. They emphasized the children's statements that Danielle was usually the aggressor. They questioned why, if she truly acted in self-defense, she would spend 11 hours cleaning the scene and deleting evidence before calling for help. They highlighted her behavior that morning, browsing dating profiles while Michael lay dead, as indicative of someone unconcerned about the man she claimed to have loved. The medical examiner's testimony about Michael's defensive wounds suggested he was trying to protect himself, not attack. For days, the jury heard testimony from witnesses, examined photographs of the bloody scene, and listened to experts debate the forensic evidence. The courtroom became a space where two competing narratives about Michael and Danielle's relationship clashed. Was this a case of a wife finally defending herself after years of abuse? Or was it a case of domestic violence where the woman was the perpetrator and then attempted to escape accountability? On June 17, 2022, the jury reached their verdict. As Danielle stood before them, her fate hanging in the balance, the foreperson read the decision. On the charge of second-degree murder, the jury found Danielle Redlick not guilty. The courtroom erupted with emotion as Danielle burst into tears, appearing to mouth, "Thank you," to the jurors who had accepted her claim of self-defense. But the verdict was not a complete acquittal. The jury found Danielle guilty of tampering with physical evidence. The conviction recognized that while they believed she had acted in self-defense during the stabbing itself, her actions in the 11 hours afterward, the cleaning, the deleting of messages, the delay in calling for help, constituted criminal tampering with evidence. The defense immediately moved for Danielle to be released from the courtroom, but the judge denied the motion, requiring her to post bond on the tampering charge before she could leave jail. It would take additional time before she was finally released, having already spent 3 years in custody awaiting trial. On her sentencing date for the tampering conviction, Danielle received 364 days in jail with credit for the 364 days she had already served, plus 12 months of probation. She was required to undergo a mental health evaluation and comply with any recommended treatment within 12 months. As she walked out of the jail following her release, Danielle exclaimed, "Praise God! Praise God!" The verdict left many in the community struggling to reconcile competing truths. At UCF, where Michael had been beloved by students and colleagues, his death remained a profound loss. More than 300 people had attended his celebration of life service shortly after his death, sharing memories of his mentorship, his humor, his dedication to helping others succeed. Students had worn red shirts to their speaker series in his honor. For them, Michael would always be the man who left a lucrative career to invest in their futures, who talked endlessly about his children with obvious pride, who embodied the values of service and community. For Jaden and Sawyer, the verdict meant their mother would not spend the rest of her life in prison for killing their father. But it could not restore what they had lost. The father who coached baseball games, who talked about batting averages with infectious enthusiasm, who took them on service trips and watched them grow with unconditional love. They had lost both parents on January 11, 2019, one to death and one to the circumstances that led to that death. The case of Michael Redlick illustrates the complexity of domestic relationships and the difficulty of determining truth when witnesses are limited and narratives conflict. The jury ultimately decided that Danielle had acted in self-defense, that in that moment when the knife entered Michael's shoulder, she genuinely feared for her life. But their conviction on the tampering charge acknowledged that her actions afterward raised serious questions about her credibility and judgment. Michael's legacy lives on in the students he mentored, the programs he built, and the children he loved more than anything else in the world. His colleagues remember him not as a victim, but as a man who chose purpose over prestige, who valued family above career advancement, who believed in giving back to the next generation. On the baseball fields where he coached Sawyer, in the service projects he led with Jaden, in the classrooms where he challenged students to dream bigger, Michael Redlick's impact endures. The morning of January 12, 2019, when Sawyer waited at that baseball field for a father who would never arrive, marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. The questions raised by Michael's death, about relationships, violence, self-defense, and truth, may never be fully answered to everyone's satisfaction. What remains certain is that a man who dedicated his final years to helping others succeed, to being present for his children, to making a positive difference in his community, died violently in his own home. Whether that death was the tragic culmination of domestic abuse or the result of a different dynamic may be legally resolved, but the loss itself, for his children, his students, his colleagues, his community, is a wound that time can soften but never fully heal. Story 3. The text message arrived on May 22, 2012, carrying with it the excitement and anticipation that only comes from being young and far from home. All ready for the concert, ma'am. I'm so excited. 10 weeks and I will be back in Ireland. Nicola Furlong typed to her mother Angela back in Curracloe, County Wexford. The 21-year-old Dublin City University student was counting down the days until she could return to the rolling green hills of Ireland's southeastern coast, to the family she loved and the familiar comforts of home. But first, there was a concert to attend, a chance to see American rapper Nicki Minaj perform at ZEP Tokyo, and Nicola was determined to make the most of her remaining weeks in Japan. Nicola had arrived in Japan months earlier as part of an exchange program, leaving behind her parents Angela and Andrew, her 2 younger sisters Andrea and Alana, and everything she knew to study at Takasaki City University of Economics in Gunma Prefecture, about 60 miles northwest of Tokyo. The decision to participate in a study abroad program reflected Nicola's adventurous spirit and her desire to experience the world beyond the small coastal village where she had grown up. Curracloe was a place of windswept beaches and tight-knit community, where everyone knew the Furlong family, and where Nicola had been raised with love and the values of warmth, generosity, and kindness that would define her short life. But as the weeks in Japan stretched into months, homesickness had begun to settle into Nicola's bones. She missed her mother's voice, her father's presence, her sister's laughter. She missed the familiar rhythms of Irish life, the accent of her neighbors, the taste of home-cooked meals at the family table. The excitement of living in a foreign country, of navigating a culture and language so different from her own, had given way to a longing to return to the place and people she loved. That final text message to her mother captured both Nicola's immediate excitement about the upcoming concert and her deeper anticipation of coming home in just 10 more weeks. On the evening of May 23, 2012, Nicola and a friend, another Irish woman also studying in Japan, made their way to Tokyo for the Nicki Minaj concert. The 2 young women were dressed for a night out, ready to enjoy the music and the electric atmosphere that comes with a live performance by an international star. The concert at ZEP Tokyo was everything they had hoped for, the crowd pulsing with energy, the music washing over them in waves of sound and rhythm. For a few hours, Nicola forgot about her homesickness and lost herself in the pure joy of the moment. When the concert ended and the crowd spilled out onto the streets of Tokyo's bustling Shibuya district, Nicola and her friend found themselves navigating the unfamiliar terrain in the dark, trying to determine the best route to continue their evening. It was then that they spotted 2 American men walking nearby and made what seemed like an innocuous decision. They approached the strangers to ask for directions to Shibuya, an area known for its shopping, nightlife, and vibrant energy. The 2 men were Richard Hines and James Blackston, Americans working temporarily in Japan with a touring Japanese-American musician. Hines, 19 years old, was a talented organ player from Memphis, Tennessee, while Blackston, 23, was a professional dancer from Los Angeles who performed under the stage name King Tite. Neither man had known Nicola or her friend before that chance encounter on the streets of Tokyo after midnight. But what began as a simple request for directions would spiral into a nightmare that would end with Nicola's death just hours later. The details of what happened after Nicola and her friend met Hines and Blackston remain partially unclear, but evidence presented at trial would paint a disturbing picture of predatory behavior and calculated violence. At some point during the early morning hours of May 24th, both Nicola and her friend became heavily intoxicated, their condition deteriorating to the point where they could barely function. Whether they had been plied with alcohol, drugged, or some combination of both would become a point of contention during the legal proceedings that followed. What is indisputable is that by 12:50 in the morning, Both young women were in a state of near unconsciousness when Hines and Blackston hailed a taxi and placed them in the back seat. Hines sat in the front passenger seat while Blackston climbed into the back with the two women, and the men instructed the driver to take them to the Keio Plaza Hotel in Shinjuku, one of Tokyo's most upscale hotels. Neither Hines nor Blackston realized that a surveillance camera mounted in the roof of the taxi was recording everything that happened during that ride. The footage captured by that camera would become some of the most damning evidence in the case against both men. The video showed Blackston sexually assaulting Nicola's unconscious friend in the back seat, while both men laughed and discussed in graphic terms what they planned to do to the two women. The words, captured on camera without the men's knowledge, revealed their intent with chilling clarity. These were not two men helping intoxicated young women get safely back to their hotel, but predators who saw vulnerable victims as opportunities for sexual assault. When the taxi arrived at the Keio Plaza Hotel, Hines borrowed a wheelchair from the hotel staff, claiming he needed it to transport Nicola, who was too incapacitated to walk on her own. The hotel employees, seeing what appeared to be a woman who had simply had too much to drink, allowed Hines to wheel Nicola through the lobby and up to his room without checking whether she was a registered guest. Blackston took Nicola's friend to a separate room, where he would continue the physical assault he had begun in the taxi. Inside room 1521, Richard Hines was alone with an unconscious or semi-conscious young woman who was utterly defenseless. What happened in that room over the next several hours would be the subject of intense scrutiny. At approximately 4:11 in the morning, hotel staff received complaints about noise coming from Hines's room. When a hotel employee went to investigate, he found Nicola Furlong lying on the floor, her lips white, her body showing no signs of breathing. Hines was standing nearby, according to some accounts, paralyzed with fear. Though what terror he felt in that moment paled in comparison to the fear and pain Nicola had experienced as she was murdered. The hotel employee, recognizing that something was terribly wrong, attempted emergency resuscitation while others called for an ambulance. Paramedics rushed Nicola and her friend to Tokyo Medical University Hospital, but for Nicola, it was already too late. At 3:55 in the morning on May 24, 2012, Nicola Furlong was pronounced dead in the emergency room, her life extinguished at just 21 years old, 10 weeks before she was supposed to return home to Ireland. Her friend survived the sexual assault she had endured, but would carry the trauma of that night for the rest of her life. Hines and Blackston were arrested at the scene and taken to a Shinjuku police station for interrogation. Initially, both men were held on suspicion of sexually assaulting Nicola's friend, the act captured on the taxi's surveillance camera. On May 29, 2012, they were formally charged with quasi-forcible indecency, a charge that applied when someone sexually assaulted a victim who was incapacitated and unable to consent. But as investigators reviewed Nicola's autopsy report and examined the evidence from the hotel room, it became clear that what had happened to her went far beyond sexual assault. On June 15, 2012, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department rearrested Richard Hines on suspicion of murder. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Kenichi Yoshida, had revealed that Nicola died from strangulation, not from acute alcohol poisoning or a drug overdose as the defense would later suggest. The medical evidence indicated that Nicola had been strangled slowly over several minutes, likely with a towel, and that she had fought desperately for her life. Scratch marks on her own body showed that she had clawed at the towel around her neck as she struggled to breathe, her final moments filled with terror and pain. Back in Kuriklo, Angela Furlong was at work on a Thursday morning when she received the news that would shatter her world. Her eldest daughter, the warm and generous young woman who had been excited about a concert just days before, was dead, murdered in a Tokyo hotel room thousands of miles from home. The grief that descended on the Furlong family was almost unbearable, a pain that Angela would later describe as something that would never go away. "I miss her so much," Angela said 10 years after Nicola's death, her voice carrying the weight of a decade of mourning. When news of Nicola's murder reached the international community, even Nicki Minaj, the rapper whose concert Nicola had attended just hours before her death, expressed her sorrow. "Saddened to learn one of my precious fans, found tragically murdered in Japan," Minaj tweeted. "My love and prayers are with the family of Nicola Furlong." The message, while small comfort to a grieving family, acknowledged that Nicola had been a real person with hopes and dreams, not just a statistic or a headline. On July 26, 2012, a Japanese court ruled that Richard Hines, though only 19 years old at the time of the murder, would be tried as an adult rather than in juvenile court. The decision came after judges considered victim impact statements from the Furlong family and reviewed police reports into the case, concluding that the severity of the crime warranted adult prosecution. The ruling meant that Hines could theoretically face the death penalty if convicted, though in practice Japan reserved capital punishment for cases involving multiple victims. The trial began on March 4, 2013, at Tokyo District Court, presided over by a panel that included 3 professional judges and 6 civilian lay judges. Richard Hines pleaded not guilty to the murder of Nicola Furlong, setting the stage for a legal battle that would hinge on competing narratives about what had happened in room 1521. The prosecution, led by attorney Kenji Horikoshi, accused Hines of strangling Nicola to death with a towel after getting her drunk and possibly drugging her with the intent to commit rape. When she regained consciousness and fought back, they argued, Hines silenced her permanently. The defense, led by attorney Kenji Hattori, countered that Nicola had died of a self-induced overdose of alcohol and drugs, and that any physical contact between Hines and the victim had been part of consensual activity. They suggested that Hines had only lightly pressed on her neck during activity and had not intended to cause her death. The defense's strategy relied on painting Nicola as a willing participant in everything that had happened, a characterization that would enrage her family and the presiding judge. Dr. Kenichi Yoshida, testifying for the prosecution, definitively rejected the defense's theory. He asserted that Nicola had died from strangulation, that the process had taken several minutes, and that she had died a slow and painful death while fighting desperately to survive. The scratch marks on her body, the medical evidence of prolonged pressure on her neck, and the absence of lethal levels of alcohol or drugs in her system all supported the conclusion that this was murder, not an accidental death. Evidence indicated that a towel had been used to strangle her, not bare hands, suggesting a deliberate attempt to silence her struggles. In victim impact statements delivered to the court, the Furlong family laid bare the devastation that Nicola's murder had caused. Andrea Furlong, Nicola's younger sister, spoke of the hatred she felt and asked the court to consider the death penalty for Hines. Her words were so emotional that judges were seen with tears in their eyes as she described the loss of her beloved sister. Angela Furlong, while saying she had no wish to take a life for a life, made clear that Nicola's life had value beyond measure and that justice demanded accountability. Richard Hines took the stand in his own defense, breaking down in court and telling the Furlong family that he firmly believed he did not kill their daughter. His testimony, delivered with apparent emotion, nonetheless failed to sway the judges, who found his account inconsistent with the physical evidence and inherently implausible. The prosecution painted Hines as a predator who had shown no remorse and had consistently dishonored Nicola's memory by falsely portraying her as sexually aggressive and complicit in her own death. On March 19, 2013, the court delivered its verdict. Presiding Judge Masaru Ishizawa announced that Richard Hines had been found guilty of murdering Nicola Furlong. The judge disregarded Hines's testimony entirely, stating that the fact it took Nicola several minutes to die from strangulation was clear indication of murderous intent. Judge Ishizawa noted that Hines had shown absolutely no remorse for the murder and had instead consistently dishonored Nicola throughout the trial. The court concluded that Hines had taken an incapacitated woman to his room with intent to commit rape, and when she regained consciousness and fought back, he had strangled her to death using either a hotel towel or his own tank top. The sentence handed down was 5 to 10 years in prison with labor, the maximum penalty allowed under Japanese law for a juvenile offender. For many observers, including Nicola's family, the sentence seemed inadequate given the brutality of the crime. Outside the courthouse, Angela Furlong spoke through tears. Nicola's life was worth more than that. It really, really was. But she also expressed some measure of relief that the court had cleared her name, rejecting the defense's attempts to portray Nicola as responsible for what had happened to her. Richard Hines was sent to Fuchu Prison in western Tokyo, where he was classified as a Category 3 prisoner, meaning authorities believed he had only a moderate expectation of rehabilitation. His projected release date was November 2017, but when that time came, his parole was denied after prison officials determined he had failed to convince authorities that he was remorseful for Nicola's murder. Hines remained incarcerated until November 19, 2022, when he was finally released after serving his full sentence. He was immediately deported to the United States on a commercial flight, returning to Memphis a free man despite having taken a young woman's life. For Angela Furlong, learning that her daughter's killer was about to be released brought a fresh wave of anguish 10 years after Nicola's murder. The pain of losing Nicola had never diminished, and the knowledge that Hines would walk free while her daughter remained in a grave in Curacao was almost unbearable. "I miss her so much," Angela said in an interview marking the 10th anniversary of Nicola's death. The question, what if, haunted her constantly. What if Nicola and her friend hadn't asked those two men for directions? What if the hotel had checked the guest register before allowing Hines to bring an unconscious woman to his room? What if someone had intervened before it was too late? James Blackston, Hines's accomplice, was tried separately for the sexual assault of Nicola's friend. On March 14, 2013, he was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison with labor, with the presiding judge stating that the assault had been carried out to fulfill a desire. The sentence for Blackston's crime seemed almost trivial compared to the suffering he had caused, but at least he too faced consequences for his actions. The Furlong family announced shortly after the trial that they would pursue civil action against the Keio Plaza Hotel, alleging negligence for allowing Hines to bring Nicola to his room in a wheelchair while she was unconscious, and for failing to verify whether she was a registered guest, violations of Japanese law. The civil suit represented an attempt to hold accountable those whose failures had enabled the murder, though no amount of money could ever compensate for the loss of Nicola. Nicola Furlong was laid to rest in Ireland, her body flown home to the country she had been so eager to return to, arriving not in 10 weeks as she had anticipated, but in a coffin just days after her death. Her family, friends, and community gathered to mourn a young woman whose life had been full of promise, whose warmth and generosity had touched everyone who knew her. She had been excited about a concert, counting down the days until she could come home, making plans for a future that would never arrive. The murder of Nicola Furlong stands as a stark reminder of the vulnerability young women face when traveling abroad, of the predators who exploit trust and kindness, and of the importance of vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. It is a story of a chance encounter that turned deadly, of men who saw an intoxicated young woman not as a person in need of help, but as an opportunity for sexual violence. And it is a story of a family's endless grief, of a mother who will never stop missing her daughter, of sisters who will forever carry the hole left by Nicola's absence. 10 years after Nicola's death, Angela Furlong's words capture the permanent nature of her loss. The pain of losing Nicola will never go away. Richard Hines may have served his sentence and returned to his life in America, but for the Furlong family, the sentence is life without parole, a lifetime of missing the daughter and sister who should still be with them, who should have come home from Japan in June 2012 with stories to tell and a future ahead of her. Nicola Furlong deserved to live, to grow old, to fulfill all the promise she carried. Instead, she became another victim of violence, her name a reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastation of its untimely loss. Story 4. The streets of Motomachi in Kobe's Chul ward had always carried a certain reputation. This was a district where the night economy thrived, where neon signs beckoned from narrow alleys, and where businesses of questionable morality operated in a gray zone between legal and illegal. Among these establishments were the telephone dating clubs, places where lonely men could call in, pay by the minute, and be connected with women willing to talk, flirt, or arrange to meet. It was an industry built on loneliness and desire, and like any profitable enterprise in Japan's underground economy, it attracted both entrepreneurs and criminals. In the year 2000, Kyoko Nakai was 65 years old and the operator of 2 telephone dating clubs in Kobe. She had carved out a small territory in this competitive world, building a business that provided her with income and a measure of respect in circles where respect was hard-earned. She knew the rules of this world. Pay protection money to the right people, keep the police happy with occasional cooperation, and never let competitors encroach on your territory. For years, this system had worked. Her clubs operated smoothly, and she maintained her position in the Motomachi district's delicate ecosystem. But in the late 1990s, a new player entered the scene, and everything began to change. Rin House was not just another small operation run by someone content with a single location and modest profits. This was an ambitious enterprise with expansion plans, professional management, and the kind of capital that suggested backing from powerful interests. By the time Kyoko Nakai truly understood what was happening, Rin House had already opened 4 outlets across Kobe, each one professionally run, each one attracting customers who might otherwise have called her clubs. Competition in the telephone dating club business was not like competition in legitimate industries. There were no advertising campaigns, no price wars fought in newspapers, no appeals to customer loyalty through rewards programs. In this world, competition meant territory, and territory was defended through intimidation, violence, and connections to organized crime. Nakai watched as Rin House grew, taking customers, taking revenue, taking her future. She felt the walls closing in, sensed that her business was being slowly strangled by this newcomer that refused to respect the established order. Kyoko Nakai was not the type to surrender what she had built. She had operated in Kobe's underworld long enough to know that survival required decisive action. If Rin House would not back down, if they would not respect her territory, then they would have to be removed. She needed someone who could do what needed to be done, someone who understood violence and had no qualms about using it. She needed someone who would work for money and ask no questions. She found him in Akihiro Sakamoto, a 45-year-old drug trafficker from Hiroshima. Sakamoto was not a gang member in the traditional sense, not someone bound by Yakuza codes of honor or loyalty. He was something more dangerous, a freelancer, a man who moved through the criminal underworld taking jobs, making connections, and leaving no trail that could be traced back to him. He had a reputation for getting things done, and for asking no questions about the consequences. When Kyoko Nakai approached him with her problem, he listened carefully. When she told him what she wanted done, he named his price. It was not cheap, but she agreed. Some investments were worth making. Sakamoto assembled his team carefully. He recruited Kazuyuki Sano, a 44-year-old heavy machine operator who needed money and had no moral objections to how he earned it. Sano was strong, capable, and willing to follow orders. He also brought in Shinya Kamino, a 30-year-old unemployed man who had drifted through life without purpose until crime gave him something to do and a way to pay for his habits. For the role of driver, Sakamoto recruited Kenichi Hori, a 37-year-old former gangster who knew how to navigate Kobe's streets and how to disappear when necessary. The plan was simple in its brutality. Firebomb 2 of Rin House's locations in the Motomachi district. The attacks would send an unmistakable message. This was not about destroying all 4 locations. It was about demonstrating that Rin House was vulnerable, that their expansion had made enemies, and that continuing to operate in Kobe would mean continued violence. Sakamoto and Nakai believed that after such an attack, the owners of Rin House would understand it was time to leave Kobe, to take their business elsewhere and stop threatening the established operators. The early morning hours of March 2nd, 2000, were chosen for the attack. This was the time when the telephone dating clubs would still have customers inside, men who had come seeking connection, and were sitting in small booths making their calls. The clubs would also have employees working the late shift, young women who staffed the phones and managed the logistics. It was precisely this combination, customers and staff present, but not so many that escape would be impossible, that made the timing perfect for maximum impact. Sakamoto and his team prepared Molotov cocktails, those crude but effective weapons that had been used in conflicts around the world for decades. Glass bottles filled with gasoline, stuffed with cloth wicks, simple to make and devastating when thrown into enclosed spaces. They loaded the firebombs into Hori's car and drove through the quiet streets of Motomachi in the pre-dawn darkness. The city was sleeping, and the few people still awake at this hour were either workers ending late shifts or customers like those in the telephone dating clubs, seeking something in the night they could not find during the day. When they reached the first Rin house location, Sano and Camino exited the vehicle. The building stood before them, lights glowing from within, completely unaware of what was about to happen. They lit the wicks of their Molotov cocktails, the flames flickering in the darkness, and then they threw. Glass shattered. Fire bloomed instantly, spreading with the terrifying speed that only gasoline-fed flames can achieve. The men ran back to the car, and Hori drove them to the second location. Again, they repeated the attack. Again, fire erupted. Then they disappeared into the night, leaving behind chaos and death. Inside the first Rin house location, panic erupted as flames spread across the floor and began climbing the walls. The customers who had been sitting in private booths making their calls suddenly found themselves trapped in a burning building. Smoke filled the air almost instantly, thick and black and toxic. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer produced by incomplete combustion, began to build up in the enclosed space. Some people tried to run for the exits, but the flames had already blocked the main escape routes. Others tried to find windows to break through to fresh air, but the smoke was so thick they could barely see. For customers never made it out. They died where they fell, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning before the flames could reach them. Their families would later learn that their loved ones had died not in car accidents or workplace incidents or any of the ordinary ways that people die, but in a telephone dating club, killed because they happened to be there when someone else's business dispute turned violent. For employees were also injured, some with light burns and smoke inhalation, others more seriously hurt as they tried to escape or help customers to safety. The fire department responded quickly, but by the time they arrived and brought the flames under control, the damage was done. For people were dead, several others were injured, and 2 Rin house locations had been destroyed. The police investigation began immediately. This was clearly arson, clearly intentional, and the use of Molotov cocktails suggested organized crime involvement. Detectives from the Hyogo Prefectural Police began interviewing witnesses, examining the crime scenes, and following leads through Kobe's underworld. The investigation moved quickly in some ways and slowly in others. Within months, police had identified and arrested Kazuyuki Sano and Shinya Camino, the 2 men who had actually thrown the fire bottle. Both were charged with arson, and as the investigation continued, prosecutors added murder and attempted murder charges after determining that the accused were consciously negligent, a legal determination meaning they were aware that their actions could result in death but proceeded anyway. The evidence against them was solid. Witnesses had seen them near the scene. Forensic evidence tied them to the attacks, and under interrogation, they eventually admitted their roles. But Sano and Camino were foot soldiers, hired hands who had carried out orders for money. The investigators knew there had to be more to the story. Who had planned the attack? Who had paid for it? Why had Rin House been targeted? As the investigation deepened, a picture began to emerge of a business rivalry that had turned deadly, of an established operator who felt threatened by a new competitor and decided to use violence to eliminate that threat. The trail led to Akihiro Sakamoto, the drug trafficker from Hiroshima, who had assembled the team and coordinated the attack. Sakamoto was identified as the main culprit, the organizer who had turned Kyoko Nakai's desire for revenge into a concrete plan of action. But Sakamoto was careful, and for years he remained beyond the reach of investigators, moving through Japan's criminal underworld, perhaps protected by connections, perhaps simply lucky. Kenichi Hori, the driver, proved even more elusive. After the attacks, he disappeared completely. A wanted list was issued, and his name and photograph were distributed to police stations across Japan. But Hori had experience evading law enforcement. As a former gangster, he knew how to stay hidden, how to move without leaving traces. Years would pass with Hori on the lam, a fugitive who had driven the getaway car and then driven right out of the investigators' reach. The most surprising revelation came 6 years after the attacks. In February 2006, police arrested Kyoko Nakai herself. She was 71 years old now, still operating her telephone dating clubs in Kobe, apparently believing that enough time had passed, that the investigation had moved on, that she was safe. But investigators had never stopped working the case. They had interviewed countless people in Kobe's underworld, followed financial trails, and slowly built a case against the woman who had ordered the attacks. Nakai was charged with murder and arson. The prosecution argued that she had felt threatened by Rin House's expansion and had offered Sakamoto a substantial sum of money to carry out the firebombing attacks. The amount was described as a huge reward, enough to motivate Sakamoto to assemble his team and execute the plan. On the same day Nakai was arrested, investigators also took custody of Akihiro Sakamoto and 2 other suspects, transferring them from detention centers in Hiroshima and other locations to face charges in Kobe. The trial revealed the full scope of Nakai's role. She had not thrown the firebombs herself, had not lit the wicks or shattered the windows, but she had conceived the plan, provided the funding, and set in motion the events that led to 4 deaths and multiple injuries. Under Japanese law, this made her as culpable as those who had actually carried out the attacks. She had treated human lives as obstacles to be removed, customers and employees as acceptable casualties in her business dispute. The Kobe District Public Prosecutor's Office sought life imprisonment for all those involved in the planning and execution of the attacks. Kazuyuki Sano and Shinya Kamino, the men who had thrown the firebombs, were tried first. Both were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. They appealed the verdicts to both the district court and the high court, but both courts upheld the life sentences. The message was clear. In Japan, taking 4 lives in an arson attack meant spending the rest of your days behind bars. Kyoko Nakai was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. At her age, this was effectively a death sentence, a guarantee that she would never again walk free, would never again operate her telephone dating clubs, or navigate the streets of Motomachi as a businesswoman. She would spend her remaining years in a Japanese prison, surrounded by concrete walls and other women who had also crossed the line from crime into murder. Akihiro Sakamoto, identified as the main culprit and organizer, faced similar charges and similar consequences. The evidence showed that he had been the link between Nakai's desire for revenge and the actual firebottle attacks. He had recruited the team, planned the logistics, and ensured the attacks were carried out. While Nakai had provided the motive and the money, Sakamoto had provided the means and the method. His conviction and life sentence ensured he would join Sano, Kamino, and Nakai in prison for the rest of his natural life. Only Kenichi Hori remained free, still wanted by police, still on the run. His role as driver made him less culpable than the others in some ways, but he was still an essential part of the conspiracy. Without him, the attack team would have had no way to move between locations, no way to escape after throwing the firebombs. His continued freedom remained a frustration for investigators and a reminder that some criminals, through luck or skill or connections, managed to evade justice. The case became a stark example of how business competition in Japan's underground economy could escalate into lethal violence. Kyoko Nakai was not a Yakuza boss, not a violent criminal with a history of murders. She was a businesswoman who operated illegal businesses, but she had apparently believed there were still rules, still boundaries that separated commerce from murder. When Rin Rin House threatened her livelihood, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She chose to eliminate the competition through fire and death, and in making that choice, she became a murderer. The 4 customers who died in the attack were ordinary men seeking connection in the early morning hours of March 2nd, 2000. They had no idea they were walking into a war zone, no knowledge that the telephone club they were visiting had been targeted for destruction. They died because Kyoko Nakai felt threatened, because Akihiro Sakamoto was willing to kill for money, and because Kazuyuki Sano and Shinya Kamino were willing to throw firebombs through windows without caring who was inside. The employees who were injured were young women trying to earn money, completely unaware that their workplace had been marked for violence. The case show of how quickly greed and fear can transform into violence, how easily business disputes in the criminal world can escalate from words to actions to death. It demonstrates the dangers of operating in industries where legal recourse is impossible and where disputes must be settled through other means. And it shows that Japanese justice, though sometimes slow, has long reach and long memory. 6 years passed between the attacks and Kyoko Nakai's arrest, but the investigators never forgot, never stopped building their case, never gave up on bringing everyone involved to justice. Today, Kyoko Nakai remains in prison, serving her life sentence. Kazuyuki Sano and Shinya Kamino are likewise imprisoned, their appeals exhausted, their futures consisting of nothing but prison walls and prison routines. Akihiro Sakamoto, the organizer, shares their fate. Only Kenichi Hori remains unaccounted for, somewhere in Japan or perhaps having fled abroad, always looking over his shoulder, always knowing that his name remains on wanted lists, always aware that the statute of limitations on murder never expires. Story 5. The afternoon of March 25, 2010, was winding down in Independence, Missouri, a city that sprawls across the eastern suburbs of Kansas City, where tree-lined streets are dotted with churches, small businesses, and the modest homes of hard-working families. Randy Stone, a 42-year-old insurance agent, sat in his office on Noland Road, wrapping up the day's paperwork and preparing to close up for the evening. Randy was a fixture in the community, known for his dedication to his clients at Farmers Insurance, where he had worked as an independent agent for 13 years. He was a man of deep faith, an active member of New Hope Baptist Church, where he served as Sunday school teacher and minister of records, managing the congregation's finances with meticulous care. He was a devoted father to his 2 children and had been married to his wife Teresa for nearly 2 decades. On the surface, Randy Stone's life seemed stable, successful, and grounded in the values he held dear. But beneath that surface, forces were moving that would destroy everything. Randy did not hear the door open behind him as he worked at his desk. He did not have time to turn around before the gunshot rang out, the sound echoing through the small office. The bullet struck him, and he collapsed, his body falling to the floor beside his desk. The shooter fired again, ensuring that Randy would not survive. Within moments, Randy Stone was dead, his life ended not by a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong, but by someone he knew, someone he had trusted, someone who had been welcomed into the most intimate spaces of his family's life. When police arrived at the scene, summoned by a frantic 911 call, they found evidence that immediately told them this was not a typical robbery. Randy's body lay on the floor of his office, but approximately $100 in cash remained on his desk untouched. His wallet had not been taken. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. The office was orderly except for the terrible violence that had occurred within it. Investigators recognized immediately that Randy Stone had known his killer, that whoever had pulled the trigger had walked into that office without arousing suspicion or alarm. The question facing detectives was simple in theory, but devastatingly complex in practice. Who wanted Randy Stone dead? The answer began to emerge as investigators looked more closely at Randy's personal life, and discovered a web of deception that had been spun over the course of a decade. At the center of that web was Teresa Stone, Randy's wife, and David Love, the pastor of New Hope Baptist Church. What appeared to be a devoted marriage and a trusting relationship between a congregant and his spiritual leader was in fact a facade concealing an affair that had lasted 10 years, conducted in secret through burner phones, clandestine meetings, and elaborate lies told to everyone around them. The affair between Teresa and David Love had begun years earlier, when Teresa had sought counseling from the pastor regarding problems in her marriage. David was the senior pastor at New Hope Baptist Church, a position of authority and trust within the community. He was married to Kim and had children of his own. But somewhere in those counseling sessions, professional boundaries dissolved and an intimate relationship developed. What started with physical touches that church members noticed but dismissed as the closeness of a faith-based relationship soon escalated into a full-blown affair characterized by intense emotional attachment and elaborate planning to keep it hidden. The lovers communicated through track phones, cheap prepaid cell phones that could be purchased without leaving a paper trail and discarded when necessary. They sent each other thousands of text messages and emails filled with declarations of love and dreams of a future together. David bought Teresa an engagement ring, a symbol of his commitment to her and his intention to leave his wife and marry her once they were both free. For 10 years, they maintained this double life, attending church services together where David preached about morality and family values while secretly planning a life with another man's wife. But by early 2010, the carefully constructed lies that had sustained the affair for a decade began to crumble. Randy Stone, meticulous and observant by nature, had begun to suspect that something was wrong in his marriage. He noticed changes in Teresa's behavior, inconsistencies in her explanations of where she had been and what she had been doing. His suspicions intensified when he began reviewing the financial records of New Hope Baptist Church in his capacity as minister of records. What he discovered shocked him. Thousands of dollars were missing from the church accounts, money that had been diverted and could not be properly accounted for. Randy brought his findings to church leadership, setting off an internal investigation that would have profound consequences. On March 16, 2010, just 9 days before Randy's murder, the situation reached a breaking point. Randy confronted church leadership with evidence of financial impropriety, and the investigation revealed that funds had been misappropriated. While the extent of David Love's involvement in the missing money was unclear, Randy's actions in exposing the financial irregularities created a crisis. Randy, unwilling to be associated with the scandal and increasingly uncomfortable with the situation at New Hope Baptist Church, wrote an email announcing that he was resigning from his positions as Sunday school teacher and minister of records. He made it clear that he and his family would be leaving the church entirely. For David Love, Randy's decision to leave the church represented a catastrophic threat. Randy had discovered not only the financial problems, but also evidence of the affair between Teresa and David. If Randy left the church and took Teresa with him, David would lose access to the woman he had been involved with for 10 years. If Randy exposed the affair publicly, David's reputation would be destroyed, his position as pastor would be untenable, and his marriage would likely end. The carefully constructed world that David had built, where he could maintain his respectable public persona while pursuing his secret relationship, was collapsing around him. On March 16th, the same day that Randy announced his intention to leave the church, Teresa sent David a text message that prosecutors would later characterize as the smoking gun. She wanted Randy gone. The phrase was ambiguous enough to maintain some deniability, but in context, its meaning was clear. Teresa wanted her husband out of the picture permanently, clearing the way for her to be with David. David Love, facing the destruction of everything he valued and driven by his obsession with Teresa, began planning Randy Stone's murder. He knew Randy's routines, knew where he worked, knew when he would be vulnerable. Teresa provided crucial assistance, giving David information about Randy's schedule and, most damningly, telling David where Randy kept his gun and how to access it. The murder weapon would ultimately be traced back to Randy's own firearm, a bitter irony that Randy had been killed with his own gun, stolen from his home by the people who claimed to love him. On the afternoon of March 25, 2010, David Love drove to Randy Stone's insurance office on Noland Road. He entered the office with purpose, knowing exactly what he had come to do. Randy, unsuspecting and trusting, did not see the danger until it was too late. David shot Randy, killing him with the precision of someone who had thought through every step. He left the scene quickly, taking Randy's gun with him, but leaving behind the cash and valuables that would have been taken in a robbery, a detail that would prove crucial in investigators' eventual determination that this was a targeted killing. Teresa Stone's performance in the aftermath of the murder was carefully orchestrated. When Randy failed to come home that evening, she went to his office, ostensibly to check on him. She found him dead on the floor, his body already growing cold. Teresa called her parents first, before calling 911, telling them that Randy had been shot. When police arrived, she was distraught, playing the role of the grieving widow. But investigators noticed things that struck them as odd. Teresa's emotional state seemed to fluctuate in ways that didn't quite fit the expected patterns of genuine grief. When Robert Davis, a farmer's insurance district manager, arrived at the Stone home after Teresa called to inform him of Randy's death, he suggested they talk on the front porch. The moment they stepped outside, away from her parents, Teresa immediately regained her composure and began asking detailed questions about Randy's life insurance policies. The life insurance question was particularly striking to investigators. Randy had carried approximately $725,000 in life insurance, an enormous sum that would transform Teresa's financial situation. That Teresa's first concern in the immediate aftermath of her husband's murder was securing information about insurance payouts suggested to detectives that her priorities were not those of a genuinely grieving spouse. As investigators began processing the crime scene and interviewing witnesses, they discovered evidence that pointed them toward the truth. In a wastebasket in Randy's office, they found a torn-up love letter, the paper ripped into pieces but still readable when reassembled. The letter was addressed to Teresa and spoke of deep romantic love, promising that the writer would love her until the end of the world. But when investigators compared the handwriting in the letter to Randy's handwriting on other documents in the office, they quickly determined that Randy had not written the letter. Someone else was sending Teresa love letters, someone who might have a motive to want Randy dead. The investigation expanded to examine Teresa's activities on the day of the murder. She provided police with a detailed timeline of her whereabouts, claiming she had been busy with errands, making a bank deposit, seeing a chiropractor, picking up her daughter from school around 3:15, and then going to a Sonic restaurant. She produced receipts and referenced video footage that she claimed would verify her movements throughout the afternoon. On the surface, her alibi seemed solid, but as investigators dug deeper, they began to find inconsistencies and troubling details that suggested Teresa knew more than she was saying. A crucial break in the case came when investigators interviewed witnesses who could speak to the relationship dynamics within the Stone family and the church community. Kim Love, David's wife, became a person of interest as investigators learned about the counseling sessions David had conducted with Teresa over the years. Kim admitted that she had been uncomfortable with the amount of time her husband spent with Teresa, that she had noticed their relationship seemed unusually close. As investigators pressed further, presenting evidence they had uncovered, Kim's discomfort transformed into cooperation. She revealed information about burner phones, about her husband's secretive behavior, about times when David had been unaccounted for. The picture of a decade-long affair began to come into focus. Confronted with mounting evidence, David Love eventually broke. In November 2011, 19 months after Randy Stone's murder, David pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. In exchange for his guilty plea and his cooperation in the case against Teresa, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be free again. During his confession, David admitted that he had been the one who shot Randy Stone in Randy's office, that he had planned the murder with Teresa, and that Teresa had provided him with crucial information that made the killing possible. David's guilty plea and detailed confession provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to charge Teresa Stone. In 2011, Teresa was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence against her was substantial. The text messages between her and David expressing their desire to be rid of Randy, David's testimony that Teresa had told him where Randy kept his gun and how to access it, the engagement ring David had bought for Teresa, and the suspicious behavior Teresa had exhibited immediately after Randy's death. Teresa initially maintained her innocence, claiming that while she had been involved in an affair with David, she had not participated in planning Randy's murder. But as her trial date approached and she was faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, Teresa changed her strategy. In early 2012, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, admitting her role in the plot to kill her husband. Under the terms of her plea agreement, Teresa faced a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. The sentencing hearing in June 2012 was an emotional and revealing proceeding that lasted 90 minutes and provided the public with the first comprehensive look at the evidence that had been compiled against Teresa Stone. Prosecutors presented transcripts of text messages between Teresa and David, messages that showed the intensity of their relationship and their discussions about removing Randy from their lives. They presented evidence about the track phones the lovers had used to communicate. They detailed how Teresa had provided David with information about Randy's whereabouts and how to access his gun. Perhaps most damningly, they presented testimony from Pastor David Love himself, who told the court that on the day of the murder, as police were processing the crime scene and Teresa was being questioned by detectives, David had found a moment to speak with Teresa privately. His whispered words to her were chilling in their implications. Get rid of the track phone. And if police ask you about Randy's gun, tell them he sold it 3 months ago. Family members of Randy Stone addressed the court during the sentencing hearing, their victim impact statements revealing the depth of pain and anger they felt toward Teresa. Shelley Bell, Randy's niece, pointed out that Randy would have been 45 years old that week. She asked Judge John Roldan to impose the maximum sentence, calling Teresa's actions a cold-hearted decision that deserved the harshest punishment available under the plea agreement. Randy's mother spoke about the man her son had been, honest, hard-working, devoted to his children, betrayed by the people he trusted most. She described the devastating impact Randy's death had on his children, who had lost their father and had to come to terms with their mother's role in his murder. Teresa's attorney, John O'Connor, attempted to paint his client in a more sympathetic light. He noted that Teresa had no prior criminal record, that she had been a productive member of society before becoming entangled in the affair with David Love. He argued that Teresa had been manipulated by the pastor, that David had used his position of spiritual authority to draw her into a relationship that ultimately led to terrible consequences. The defense suggested that Teresa deserved leniency because she had ultimately cooperated with prosecutors and taken responsibility for her actions by pleading guilty. But Judge Roldan, after considering all the evidence and listening to the arguments from both sides, showed little sympathy for Teresa Stone. He noted the calculated nature of the conspiracy, the fact that Teresa had actively participated in planning her husband's death, and the special cruelty of the betrayal given that the killer was someone Randy had trusted and respected. On June 15, 2012, Judge Roldan sentenced Teresa Stone to 8 years in prison, a substantial sentence that reflected the seriousness of her crime while falling short of the 10-year maximum. The case of Randy Stone's murder sent shockwaves through Independence, Missouri, and particularly through the New Hope Baptist Church community. Members of the congregation struggled to reconcile the pastor they had trusted with the man who had committed murder. The revelation that David Love and Teresa Stone had been carrying on an affair for 10 years, conducting their relationship under the noses of Randy, Kim Love, and the entire church community, raised disturbing questions about deception and betrayal. How could so many people have been so completely deceived? How could a pastor, someone entrusted with spiritual guidance and moral leadership, have lived such a profound double life? For Randy Stone's children, the tragedy was compounded by the impossible position they found themselves in. Their father had been murdered, and their mother was in prison for conspiring to kill him. Family members who spoke to media after Teresa's sentencing expressed frustration and anger that the children had to grow up with this burden, that they would always carry the knowledge of what their mother had done. Some reports suggested that the children struggled with divided loyalties, loving their mother despite her crimes, a psychological complexity that would require years of counseling and support to navigate. The financial motive that had partially driven the murder plot never materialized for Teresa. Instead of living a life of ease and luxury with her new husband and as much as $800,000 in life insurance payouts, Teresa left the courthouse in handcuffs, sentenced to 8 years behind bars. David Love, who had hoped to start a new life with Teresa after eliminating the obstacles of Randy and potentially his own wife, instead received a life sentence that ensured he would die in prison. The dreams they had shared in thousands of text messages and secret phone calls had been built on a foundation of lies and murder, and when that foundation crumbled, it took everything with it. Story 6. The late summer night of August 1st, 1986, settled over Merseyside with the kind of warm humidity that makes people restless and draws them out into the streets and pubs of England's northwest coast. In the town of Bebington, near Birkenhead, 21-year-old Diane Sindall finished her shift at the Wellington Hotel, where she worked as a barmaid to save money for her upcoming wedding. She was young, engaged, and looking forward to a future that seemed full of promise. As closing time approached, she said her goodbyes to colleagues and customers, climbed into her van, and began the drive home to Seacombe. But somewhere along Borough Road in Birkenhead, her vehicle ran out of fuel. It was a simple mechanical problem, the kind of unfortunate inconvenience that happens to countless drivers every day. Diane had no choice but to abandon the van and walk, presumably hoping to find a petrol station or call for help. A taxi driver later reported seeing a man and a woman arguing on the street sometime after midnight. Between midnight and 2 in the morning, witnesses in the area heard screaming, the kind of desperate sounds that pierce the night and make people freeze in their homes, wondering if they should intervene or call for help. When morning came on August 2nd, 1986, a discovery was made that would horrify the community and launch the largest murder investigation in Merseyside police history. Diane Sindall's body was found in an alleyway off Borough Road, half naked and brutalized beyond recognition. The violence inflicted upon her was almost incomprehensible in its savagery. Her face had been beaten and mutilated with a blunt object, possibly a pipe or brick. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest. She had been raped and subjected to mutilation. Her skull was fractured, and the pathologist who examined her remains stated that her injuries were the very worst he had ever seen on a body outside of a road traffic accident. Medical examination revealed an even more chilling detail. Diane had remained alive for some time after the initial attack, suffering through her injuries before finally succumbing to a brain hemorrhage caused by multiple blows to her head. The cause of death was determined to be that brain hemorrhage, the final consequence of an assault so vicious that the perpetrator would later be dubbed by the media as the Mersey Ripper, the Beast of Birkenhead, and the Wolfman. The murder sent shockwaves through Merseyside. Communities that had felt relatively safe suddenly confronted the reality that someone capable of such extreme violence was walking among them. Women became afraid to be out alone on the streets at night, their movements constrained by the knowledge that Diane had been ambushed and killed while simply trying to get home. The brutality of the crime created a palpable sense of fear and anger throughout the region. Merseyside police launched an unprecedented investigation, dedicating enormous resources to finding whoever had committed this atrocity. 2 weeks after Diane's murder, investigators discovered additional evidence at Bidston Hill, a beauty spot approximately 2 miles from the alleyway where her body had been found. Partially burned in what appeared to be a small fire were Diane's jeans and handbag, along with someone else's suede coat. Witnesses reported having seen a small fire at that location and a man running away from it. The discovery suggested that the killer had attempted to destroy evidence linking him to the crime, but had not been entirely successful. As the investigation progressed through late August and into September, detectives interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses and followed countless leads. The pressure to solve the case was immense, both from the public demanding answers and from within the police force itself. In this environment of urgency and determination, investigators turned their attention to a 30-year-old unemployed laborer from Birkenhead named Peter Sullivan. Sullivan was arrested on September 23, 1986, approximately 7 weeks after Diane's murder. The evidence that led to his arrest was entirely circumstantial. He had reportedly given conflicting statements about his whereabouts on August 1st and 2nd, inconsistencies that made him a person of interest to investigators. But what happened to Peter Sullivan after his arrest would become the foundation for one of the longest and most egregious miscarriages of justice in British legal history. According to Sullivan's later testimony, his time in police custody was a nightmare of coercion and abuse. He claimed that officers beat him repeatedly, denied him food and sleep, and refused him access to legal representation. He stated that police threatened him with rape charges if he did not confess to Diane's murder. The psychological pressure was relentless, hour after hour of interrogation designed to break him down. Sullivan believed he had been stitched up by police desperate to solve a case that had terrified the entire region. On September 24th, after hours of interrogation and alleged physical abuse, Peter Sullivan reportedly broke down in tears and confessed to murdering Diane Sindall. But almost immediately, he withdrew that confession. Remarkably, this initial confession was never recorded, unlike many other interviews that Merseyside police conducted with Sullivan during his time in custody. The absence of any recording of such a crucial moment would later become one of many troubling aspects of the investigation. Sullivan repeated his confession in subsequent interviews, but once he was finally granted access to a solicitor on September 25th, he immediately withdrew it again and maintained his innocence. The reason he had been denied legal counsel up to that point was officially stated as concern that having a lawyer present might be a hindrance to the inquiry. This reasoning violated standard procedures and would become another point of contention in the years to come. The manner in which the confession was obtained raised additional red flags that were apparently overlooked or ignored at the time. During one interrogation session, an officer asked Sullivan to indicate on a map where Diane's clothes were hidden. When Sullivan pointed to the wrong location, the officer allegedly told him which spot he should point to instead. This interaction suggested that Sullivan did not actually have guilty knowledge of the crime, but was instead being coached by investigators. A psychological assessment would later reveal that Peter Sullivan was suggestible and had limited intellectual capacity. Despite being aware that Sullivan had learning disabilities, the police did not provide an appropriate adult to be present during his interrogations, as was required by law. This failure to follow proper procedures for vulnerable suspects would prove to be another critical flaw in the investigation. When Peter Sullivan's trial began in 1987, the prosecution's case rested on two main pillars of evidence. The first was his confessions, despite the fact that he had withdrawn them and consistently maintained his innocence. The second was expert testimony about bite marks found on Diane's body, which forensic odontologists claimed matched Sullivan's teeth. Prosecutors suggested that Sullivan had attacked Diane in a drunken rage after losing a game of darts earlier in the day. Crucially, semen samples that had been recovered from Diane's body during the post-mortem examination were not analyzed for DNA evidence. The technology existed in 1987, as DNA profiling had been developed by Sir Alec Jeffreys at the University of Leicester in 1984 and was already beginning to be used in criminal cases. However, this technology was not yet available to Merseyside police at the time of Sullivan's trial. Those samples were stored away, preserved as evidence but never subjected to the kind of analysis that would eventually prove crucial. Peter Sullivan pleaded not guilty to the murder charge, but the jury believed the prosecution's case. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 60 years. At age 30, Sullivan entered the British prison system for a crime he insisted he did not commit. His steadfast refusal to admit guilt, while morally principled, would actually work against him in practical terms. In the British parole system, expressions of remorse and acceptance of responsibility for one's crimes are often viewed as evidence of rehabilitation. By continuing to maintain his innocence, Sullivan essentially guaranteed that he would serve far more than his minimum sentence. The years became decades as Peter Sullivan remained behind bars. He attempted multiple appeals, each one rejected. In 2008, he applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, an independent body that examines potential miscarriages of justice in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Sullivan raised concerns about his police interviews, the bite mark evidence presented at his trial, and what had been claimed to be the murder weapon. The CCRC consulted with experts from the Forensic Science Service, who advised that any further DNA testing of the stored samples would be very unlikely to produce a usable profile. Based on this expert opinion, Sullivan's case was not referred to the Court of Appeal. In 2019, Sullivan made another appeal directly to the Court of Appeal, and this too was rejected. It seemed that Peter Sullivan would spend the rest of his life in prison, one more elderly inmate serving time for a crime committed decades earlier. By this point, he had already served well beyond his 16-year minimum term, but his continued insistence on his innocence made parole boards reluctant to release him. Then in 2021, advances in forensic science offered a new possibility. The Criminal Cases Review Commission announced that improvements in DNA technology meant that retesting the stored samples from Diane Sindall's murder had become worthwhile. The biological evidence that had sat in storage for 35 years could finally be analyzed with modern techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything available in 1986 or even in 2008. The results of that testing were explosive. DNA analysis of the semen samples taken from Diane's body revealed a male genetic profile that did not match Peter Sullivan. The DNA evidence proved definitively that Sullivan had not been Diane's attacker. Moreover, the genetic markers indicated an unknown individual whose profile did not match anyone in the existing databases. Diane's family members and her fiancé were also excluded as matches. The real killer's DNA had been preserved all along, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. Based on this new evidence, the CCRC referred Peter Sullivan's case to the Court of Appeal. The Crown Prosecution Service, which had originally convicted Sullivan, reviewed the DNA findings and acknowledged that the new evidence meant there was no credible basis on which the appeal can be opposed. They stated that the evidence was sufficient fundamentally to cast doubt on the safety of the conviction. On May 13, 2025, Peter Sullivan appeared before the Court of Appeal in London. 3 judges presided over the hearing. After reviewing the DNA evidence and hearing arguments, Lord Justice Holroyd delivered the court's ruling. He stated that in light of the DNA evidence proving Sullivan was not the perpetrator, it was impossible to regard Sullivan's conviction as safe. The conviction was quashed, and Peter Sullivan was ordered released immediately. At age 68, after spending 38 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit, Peter Sullivan walked free from prison. Video footage from the courtroom showed him overcome with emotion as the judges announced their decision, appearing to weep as the conviction that had stolen nearly 4 decades of his life was finally overturned, and Peter Sullivan stands as the longest-serving victim of a miscarriage of justice in the UK. Sullivan expressed a remarkable lack of bitterness despite the catastrophic injustice he had suffered. "I lost my freedom 4 decades ago for a crime I did not commit," he said. Despite the years stolen from him, he claimed to feel neither anger nor bitterness. It was a statement of almost incomprehensible grace from a man who had every reason to be consumed with rage at what had been done to him. Peter Sullivan is now recognized as the longest-serving known victim of a miscarriage of justice in British history. His case has joined a troubling list of wrongful convictions in the United Kingdom that have raised serious questions about the integrity of the British criminal justice system and the adequacy of the appeals process. The fact that Sullivan's case was rejected by the CCRC in 2008, only to be vindicated by DNA evidence just a few years later when better technology became available, has prompted soul-searching about how many other innocent people might be languishing in British prisons. Meanwhile, Merseyside Police has reopened the investigation into Diane Sindall's murder. Detective Chief Superintendent Karen Jondrell stated that the police are committed to doing everything within their power to identify whose DNA was found at the scene. Over 260 other men have been screened and ruled out as suspects. The real killer, who brutally murdered Diane Sindall on that August night in 1986, may still be alive, having escaped justice for nearly 40 years while an innocent man served time for his crime. As for compensation, Peter Sullivan now faces the bizarre and cruel requirement under UK legislation that he must prove his innocence beyond reasonable doubt if he wishes to claim compensation from the government. Despite DNA evidence definitively excluding him as Diane's attacker, despite the Court of Appeal quashing his conviction, he must still navigate a complex statutory scheme to receive any financial recognition of the decades stolen from him. The man who spent 38 years behind bars for someone else's crime now must prove what the DNA already demonstrated, that he was innocent all along. The tragedy at the heart of this case extends in multiple directions. Diane Sindall, a young woman saving money for her wedding, was murdered in the most brutal fashion imaginable, and her killer has never been brought to justice. Her family and friends have had to endure decades without closure, and now face the fresh trauma of learning that the investigation must begin again. Peter Sullivan lost 38 years of his life, 3 decades and change spent in prison cells, aging from a 30-year-old man to a 68-year-old pensioner, while the world outside continued without him. And somewhere, possibly still in the Merseyside area, possibly still alive, is the person who committed that savage murder in August 1986, and has lived free all these years while an innocent man paid the price for his crime. The case serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of justice and the catastrophic consequences when legal systems fail. It demonstrates how vulnerable people with learning disabilities and limited intellectual capacity can be steamrolled by determined investigators. It shows how bite mark evidence, once considered reliable forensic science, has been discredited as subjective and unreliable. And it illustrates the critical importance of DNA evidence in both convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent. Peter Sullivan's story will stand for generations as a cautionary tale about miscarriage of justice, and as testament to one man's refusal to accept guilt for a crime he did not commit, even when doing so might have secured his earlier release. Story 7. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Banna Avenue as Donald McKay locked the doors of his furniture store on the evening of July 15, 1977. The shop, which had been in his family since the 1920s, stood as a testament to generations of honest work in the New South Wales town of Griffith, a community built on rich soil and hard labor. At 43 years old, Donald was a man of principle and purpose, someone who believed deeply in the power of ordinary citizens to stand against corruption and injustice. As he climbed into his white panel van and drove toward the Griffith Hotel for an early evening drink with friends, he had no way of knowing that within hours he would vanish completely, becoming the center of one of Australia's most enduring criminal mysteries and the country's first political assassination. Donald Bruce McKay had been born in Griffith in 1933, though he spent much of his youth in Sydney on the city's North Shore. It was there, in the leafy suburb of Killara, that he met Barbara Vincent when he was just a teenager and she only 15 years old. Their connection was immediate and profound, a partnership that would endure through decades of community service, political activism, and ultimately tragedy. They became engaged 4 years after meeting, and Barbara moved to Griffith after graduating from the University of Sydney to begin her life with Donald. Together they built a family, welcoming 4 children into the world: Paul, Ruth, Mary, and young James, and creating a home filled with music, faith, and a deep commitment to their community. Donald and his brother Bill ran the family furniture business, serving the residents of Griffith and the surrounding Riverina district. But Donald's ambitions extended beyond commerce. He was a man who felt called to public service, someone who believed he could make a genuine difference in the lives of his neighbors through political engagement. In 1974, he stood as the federal Liberal candidate for the Riverina electorate, challenging Labor's Al Graspy and the Country Party's John Sullivan. Though Donald did not win the seat, his preferences helped unseat Graspy, demonstrating his growing influence in the region. He ran again for the state seat of Murrumbidgee in 1973 and 1976, and though he was unsuccessful in both attempts, his campaigns gave him a platform to address issues he cared about deeply. It was during these political campaigns that Donald became acutely aware of a problem festering in the heart of his beloved Griffith, a secret that was corroding the community from within. The Riverina region, with its temperate climate and fertile soil, had long been known as one of Australia's premier agricultural areas, producing vegetables, fruits, and wine for markets across the nation. But by the mid-1970s, a new and far more lucrative crop had taken root in the fields surrounding Griffith. Hidden among the legitimate market gardens, concealed behind rows of corn and carefully camouflaged from aerial surveillance, vast marijuana plantations stretched across tens of hectares, generating millions of dollars for a small circle of growers linked by family ties and a code of silence. The marijuana trade in Griffith was not the work of scattered opportunists or amateur criminals. It was a sophisticated enterprise controlled by a network of Calabrian immigrants who had brought with them from southern Italy the customs and structures of a secret criminal society known as the Ndrangheta, or the Honored Society. These families had arrived in Australia seeking opportunity and had found it first in legitimate farming, then in the explosive marijuana market of the 1970s. They operated with ruthless efficiency, pooling resources, sharing personnel, and maintaining strict omerta, a code of silence that made investigation and prosecution extraordinarily difficult. The legitimate produce businesses they operated provided perfect cover for moving their illegal product to the wholesale markets of Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide, hidden among truckloads of tomatoes and lettuce. Donald McKay watched with growing alarm as this criminal enterprise flourished in his community. He saw young people falling prey to drug addiction, observed the corrupting influence of illegal money on local businesses and institutions, and understood that laundered drug profits were undermining fair competition in the legitimate economy. As a father of 4, he worried about the effect of marijuana on youth. As a businessman, he resented those who enriched themselves through crime while honest merchants struggled. As a citizen, he was appalled by the apparent inability or unwillingness of authorities to confront the problem. The first public acknowledgement of Griffith's marijuana problem came in early 1974, when police discovered 2 plantations totaling about 10 hectares and arrested the proprietors, Rocco Barbaro and Giuseppe Scarfo. The men were convicted but received only minimal fines, $500 and $250 respectively, after being presented to the courts as poor, hard-working farmers guilty only of a first offense. The lenient sentences outraged Donald, who saw them as evidence of either judicial naivete or something far more sinister. He began writing letters to the local newspaper, the Area News, questioning the justice of such light punishment for serious drug cultivation. One letter appeared under his wife Barbara's signature, though the sentiments and concerns were clearly shared by both. But Donald did more than write letters. In October 1975, he received information about a massive marijuana plantation at Collyambally, south of Griffith. Understanding the significance of what he had learned, Donald flew to Sydney and approached officers of the New South Wales Drug Squad, urging them to investigate. The drug squad initially declined to act on his information, perhaps skeptical or perhaps reluctant to tackle what they suspected would be a complex and dangerous operation. Donald persisted. When he received additional confirmation about the crop in November, he returned to the drug squad with renewed urgency. This time, the authorities listened. On November 10, 1975, police raided the property at Kalyambali and made a discovery that shocked even experienced narcotics investigators. 32 hectares of mature marijuana plants stretched across the farmland, one of the largest single crops ever discovered in Australia at that time, with an estimated street value of $250,000, an enormous sum in 1975. The plantation represented months of careful cultivation, significant investment, and sophisticated agricultural knowledge. It was clear evidence of serious organized crime operating in the region. The subsequent investigation led to the arrest of 5 Calabrian men, including Francesco Sergi, brother-in-law of Antonio Sergi, a name that would become central to the royal commission that followed Donald's disappearance. The raid was a stunning success for law enforcement and a devastating blow to the Griffith marijuana syndicate, but it came at a terrible cost. During the trial of the arrested men, Donald McKay was identified as the informant who had provided the information that led to the Kalyambali discovery. His identity as the source became public knowledge, a revelation that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of men who had lost millions of dollars and who operated according to a ruthless code that demanded retribution against those who betrayed them. There were signs that danger was closing in. At some point before July 1977, a man identifying himself as Mr. Adams from the nearby town of Jerilderie contacted Donald's furniture store with an order for a large quantity of furniture. Donald was too busy to handle the order himself and sent his employee Bruce Pursehouse to meet with the supposed customer. When Pursehouse arrived at the designated meeting place, no one was there. Many would see this incident as a failed assassination attempt, a probe to get Donald alone and vulnerable that had been thwarted only by the accident of his busy schedule. Despite whatever concerns he may have harbored, Donald McKay did not alter his routine or seek police protection. He continued operating his business, attending community meetings, and speaking out about the drug problem in Griffith. On the evening of July 15, 1977, he followed his usual Friday pattern, closing the furniture store and heading to the Griffith Hotel on Kew Street for a drink with friends. Before leaving, he had spoken with Barbara on the telephone, telling her he would be home before 7 o'clock in the evening, so she could attend a meeting. He sat in the hotel with his companions, discussing as he often did the injustices in the local community and the urgent need to address the marijuana trade that was poisoning his town. Around 6:30 in the evening, Donald left the Griffith Hotel and walked into the car park where his white panel van was parked. What happened in the next minutes has never been conclusively established, but the evidence suggests it was swift and brutal. Donald Bruce McKay vanished into the twilight, and with him disappeared all certainty about the events of that evening. 7 hours later, at approximately 1:30 in the morning on July 16th, police discovered Donald's van still sitting in the hotel car park. The vehicle told a horrifying story. The driver's side door was smeared with blood. On the ground nearby, investigators found 3 spent .22 caliber cartridge casings. The physical evidence pointed to a violent confrontation, gunshots fired at close range, and significant bloodshed. But there was no body. Donald McKay had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only blood, bullets, and questions. The disappearance of Donald McKay shocked not just Griffith, but all of Australia. Here was a respected businessman, a father of 4, a political candidate who had dared to stand up against organized crime, and he had been erased in the car park of a public hotel on a Friday evening in a country town. The brazenness of the act, the apparent certainty that those responsible felt they could operate with impunity, sent chills through communities across the nation. If Donald McKay could be murdered for opposing drug trafficking, who else might be at risk? Barbara McKay found herself thrust into an unimaginable nightmare. Her husband was gone, almost certainly murdered, But without a body there could be no funeral, no burial, no ritual to mark his passing and begin the healing process. Her youngest son James was only 3 years old, the older children ranging from 13 to 18. She faced the prospect of raising 4 children alone, while living under the shadow of her husband's unsolved murder, and the very real possibility that those who had killed Donald remained active in her community. In 1977, she was named Mother of the Year for her serenity and single-minded sense of purpose throughout a time of great stress, a recognition of the extraordinary grace she displayed under unimaginable circumstances. The initial police investigation quickly reached a dead end. Detectives questioned hundreds of people, but the code of silence that governed Griffith's criminal underworld held firm. No one would talk. Public outrage at the apparent inability of law enforcement to solve the case or even find Donald's body grew intense. Pressure mounted on the New South Wales government to take extraordinary action. In response, Premier Neville Wran appointed Justice Philip Woodward as Royal Commissioner to conduct a comprehensive inquiry into drug trafficking in the state, with particular focus on the Griffith marijuana trade and Donald McKay's disappearance. The Woodward Royal Commission, which conducted hearings over 9 months, became a watershed moment in Australian criminal justice history. For the first time, a government inquiry publicly identified members of the Calabrian Mafia operating in Australia and exposed the staggering scale of their drug-dealing operations. Using painstaking paper chase methods to track assets that far exceeded legitimate income, the Commission documented the extraordinary wealth accumulated by a small circle of Griffith farmers. The ornate furniture, garish chandeliers, and neo-Baroque mansions they had built with their grass castles. Counsel assisting the Commission, William Fisher, presented evidence of common funds and common personnel and common method of operation that pointed to a secretive organization based on tribal or clannish loyalties, with organizational links over most of Australia. In 1979, Justice Woodward delivered his report, concluding that Donald McKay had been murdered by a hitman on behalf of the Griffith cell of the Ndrangheta. The Commission identified Robert Bob Trimboli, a businessman with ties to the Calabrian criminal network, as the person who had ordered and paid for the killing. The actual shooter, Woodward determined, was a professional hitman named James Frederick Basley. In 1984, a local coroner formally ruled that Donald McKay had died of willfully inflicted gunshot wounds on the same day he disappeared. But despite these official findings, Donald's body remained missing, hidden somewhere in the vast landscape of rural New South Wales. The criminal proceedings that followed were frustratingly incomplete. In 1986, James Frederick Basley was convicted in a Victorian court of conspiring to murder Donald McKay and was sentenced to prison. 2 other men were also convicted of conspiracy, but no one was ever charged with the actual murder itself. The distinction was crucial. Conspiracy to murder could be proven through circumstantial evidence and testimony, but charging someone with murder typically required stronger proof, ideally a body. Robert Trimboli, named by the Royal Commission as the man who had ordered the killing, fled to Spain and died there in 1987 without ever facing trial. Other members of the Griffith criminal network identified during the investigation remained free, protected by lack of evidence and the persistent code of silence. For nearly 5 decades since that July evening in 1977, police have searched for Donald McKay's remains. Detective Superintendent Michael Rowan of the Griffith Local Area Command noted that, in the decades since Mr. McKay's disappearance, police have investigated many tip-offs about the location of his remains to no avail. Over the years, nearly 3,500 people have been questioned about the case. Investigators have dug up properties, searched bushland, and followed countless leads, each time hoping to finally give the McKay family what they have sought for so long: the ability to lay Donald to rest with dignity. But the land has kept its secret. Donald's body has never been found. Barbara McKay spent the rest of her life honoring her husband's memory and continuing the fight against drugs and corruption that had cost him his life. Barbara McKay died in 2001, having never received the closure of knowing where her husband's body lay. Today, a memorial stands in Griffith honoring Donald McKay, featuring a portrait bust and commemorating his service to the community and his courage in standing against organized crime. In 2017, 40 years after his disappearance, the New South Wales Legislative Council paid tribute to the courageous Donald Bruce McKay, who was murdered in Griffith due to his selfless endeavors to stop the drug trade and corruption. His story remains a powerful reminder of the price some people pay for speaking truth to power, and of the obligations communities have to protect those who stand up against injustice. The disappearance of Donald McKay represents more than just an unsolved murder. It stands as Australia's first political assassination, a watershed moment when organized crime demonstrated its willingness to kill not just rivals or informants, but public figures who threatened its operations. The case exposed the deep roots that the Calabrian Mafia had established in rural Australia and sparked reforms in how authorities approached organized crime. The Woodward Royal Commission's findings led to increased resources for drug enforcement and greater awareness of the need to protect whistleblowers and activists.